Good morning, everyone. It is great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I can barely see beneath the lights here, and also a lot of new faces. Fantastic turnout. So I'm going to start with what may or may not be a controversial statement. Civic tech is not scaling fast enough. At Omidyar Network, we've been investing in the best and brightest civic tech entrepreneurs for over a decade, including the organizations you see here, not the least of which is Civic Hall, as Andrew mentioned. In fact, over the last 10 years, we've invested nearly $90 million in 35 civic tech organizations globally. And for us, civic tech is any technology that empowers citizens or makes government more accessible, effective, and efficient. And we have strong conviction that these technologies can really change the lives of millions of people. And we see increasing evidence of momentum in civic tech, and we certainly see increasing investment. Yet, aside from a few moments of mainstream visibility, think the healthcare.gov rescue effort, it does seem as if civic tech is perpetually hovering on the edge, just on the edge of really making it, which is both energizing because we can see the potential and frustrating because it's taking so long. So we wanted to think about what else could we do in order to help accelerate impact in civic tech aside from investing in great entrepreneurs. And so we turned to Purpose. So many of you may know Purpose. It's a public benefit corporation that works with NGOs and foundations and brands on movement building strategies. We're launching a new report with Purpose today on thinking about civic tech and what we can learn about civic tech from looking at social movements. But why movements? So movement is a word that should be used only sparingly for activities that are truly trying to make deep change in society. From women's suffrage to civil rights, to more recently climate action and marriage equality, movements can truly be engines of change in society. They create new and different pathways for citizens to engage with government and for government to respond to citizens on issues that matter to millions of people. And at first glance, civic tech may not look like a movement per se, but on closer inspection, it actually does have some similar characteristics to a movement. Like a movement, civic tech is mission-driven. It works to solve problems that benefit the public. And in most cases, it creates better public participation in decision-making. So we thought that it might be instructive to look at social movements and then look at civic tech through the lens of a social movement and see if there are things that we might learn and be able to use to drive the sector forward. So what do we ask Purpose to do? So Purpose has a really interesting methodology of looking at digital signals of social movements and mapping them against the criteria you see here. And to be clear, looking just at digital signals is, of course, going to give us an incomplete picture because there are lots of things that happen in the offline world, as we all know, not to mention the fact that not everything that's digital is available to be analyzed. So with those caveats in mind, we asked Purpose to look at the civic tech sector in the US between 2013 and 2015 and analyze the digital signals in these 5 categories. And I'm going to share a few of the highlights about what they found. So there's good news here and not so good news. So first of all, on the good news side, grassroots activity. So one of the characteristics of movements are that there's activity that is self-organized in lots of different places. And so Purpose looked at the extent to which civic tech is happening in a few places, driven by a few centralized organizations versus bubbling up in a self-organized way. And interestingly, what they found is that between 2013 and 2015, there was an 81% increase in the number of cities hosting civic tech meetups. So while New York and San Francisco are still very central to the civic tech sector, increasingly you see cities like Salt Lake City, Denver, and Virginia Beach coming on the scene and participating in the civic tech sector. Moreover, as of 2016, there were civic tech meetups, at least one, happening in 46 out of 50 states. So, for those of you here today from Idaho, Wyoming, Arkansas, or South Dakota, you know what you need to do now. And interestingly, Code for America has been a true catalyst of this grassroots activity through its brigades, which you may know are the volunteer network of coders who hack city government data. And during the time frame that Purpose analyzed, 63% of civic tech meetups were somehow associated with CFA. So they've been a true driver here. So grassroots activity looking good in civic tech. The next thing Purpose looked at is collective action, the extent to which people in civic tech are coming together to actually act. And so the first thing they found may not surprise you, which is that we like to talk a lot, especially on Twitter. But interestingly, this talk actually turns to action. And one way you can see this is that growth in tweets about civic tech is highly correlated with growth in contributions to civic tech projects on GitHub. So we are literally not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk, which is great to see. Okay, the next thing Purpose looked at is sustained engagement, the extent to which engagement in civic tech is sustained over time versus sort of blips on the radar. And like a movement, civic tech does have a very engaged core of advocates, entrepreneurs, and activists who are driving the conversation, events, and activities in civic tech. And two examples of that you see here. One are regular meetups to work on civic tech projects, and the other one is engaged tweeters. And engaged tweeters are defined as people who tweet at least twice a week on civic tech over a 3-week period. So the good news story here is that there was substantial growth in both of these engaged core constituents over the time period. Meetups up 131%, engaged tweeters up 60%. Okay, but there's a downside to this story, which is small in numbers. So to give you a point of comparison, there are 210 engaged tweeters in civic tech, most of whom are probably sitting in this room right now and are tweeting, all right? Climate Action, by contrast, has 6,500 engaged tweeters. So a real difference in scale here when you look at civic tech compared to a movement. And speaking of scale, the next thing Purpose looked at is growth and scale, specifically in civic tech, and the extent to which civic tech activity is coming out beyond the core group that's working on it and busting out into the mainstream. And here, there were some interesting findings. So in terms of growth, across a number of dimensions, there's significant growth going on in civic tech. You see the numbers here, but let me just take you through a couple of them. So conversation, which is defined as conversation on Twitter about civic tech, between 2013 and 15 was up almost 60%. Affiliation, which is defined as people who attend civic tech meetups, up over 100%. And funding, the combination of nonprofit and for-profit funding in civic tech, was up almost 120% during this time period. These are very significant growth rates, and they compare really favorably with the movements that Purpose has studied. But I think you know where I'm going with this. There is some bad news here too, which is lack of scale. So to bring this to light for you, civic tech has 17,000 tweeters per week. Climate Action has 150,000. You can do the math, but I've done it for you too. It's a 9x difference in scale. So the story here is that compared to movements, civic tech has great growth, but very small scale. Okay, and the final dimension that Purpose looked at when comparing civic tech to a movement is the notion of shared vision or identity. The extent to which civic tech has a well-articulated and understood set of core principles or goals that the community can rally around. And the way they tried to measure this was by looking at the frequency and overlap of key topics in digital conversation. And what they found is that relative to the movements they've studied, there's a high degree of diffusion of common discussion topics, which is to say many fewer people are discussing the same shared set of themes in civic tech. You see here where the greatest overlaps are, which are in open data and government transparency, followed by citizen engagement and petitioning government. So there are some building blocks here for a shared vocabulary upon which we could build a vision and an identity for civic tech, but we really have a long way to go. So Purpose looked at civic tech through the lens of a movement using these criteria, and we found some pretty interesting things. But what does it really mean for us here today? What can we do with this information to really drive the civic tech sector forward? And for us, the biggest gap that Purpose found is in this lack of shared identity and vision for civic tech. And why is this important? Because you saw these numbers about scale. We need to engage more participants in the civic tech sector. And the more people understand what we mean when we say civic tech, the more they may find their work and their interests reflected in it, and they'll be more willing to join. Secondly, we need more and different types of funding in the civic tech sector. And I can tell you from being in this field for almost 10 years now, and speaking to everyone from venture capitalists to foundations and everyone in between, that often when I describe that Omidyar Network invests in civic tech, people literally don't know what I'm talking about. So in order to attract more capital into the field, we really need to get clear on what this shared identity and vision are for civic tech. And finally, if we can get more people into civic tech and more money into civic tech, we will be able to drive greater impact in civic tech. And that's, of course, why we're all here to begin with. So to get back to my original controversial statement, we've got some work to do, but civic tech can scale. So if you're interested in talking more about this, we are launching a full report with Purpose today on this topic. It's called Engines of Change. You see the URL here, and please use the hashtag in conversation. And we'll also be having a panel at 5:15 this afternoon to talk more about the report, and specifically around this issue of shared identity and how other movements have coped with the challenge. And finally, I would just like to give a very heartfelt thank you to Josh Hendler and the entire team at Purpose for their incredible dedication and hard work to this project. Thank you.